It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This whole month, we've been looking at Toho films that did not star Godzilla. And we kicked things off with Gorath, which was an accidental monster movie when Toho demanded a monster be inserted into the film in the form of Maguma. Last week, we looked at Atragon, that not only had Manda, who would appear in Godzilla films later, but also the Gatango, a super advanced submarine that chased Manda in Godzilla Final Wars. This week, we have a really famous monster fighting against a kaiju that would eventually appear in later Godzilla films. This week, we're looking at Ishiro Honda's 1965 action sci-fi film Frankenstein vs. Baragon. Now, this stars Nick Adams, and Adams had a couple of very famous friends. James Dean, who he worked with in Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, and then Elvis Presley, who he met on the set of the 1956 film Love Me Tender. Adams never really had a spectacular career. However, he did appear in a handful of recognizable movies and TV shows, but he was not really much of a star outside of having the looks of a star. And later in his career, he appeared in this film, then later, Invasion of the Astro Monster, which was a Godzilla film that I covered here on Monster Mondays, and naturally was produced by Toho as well. This was during a time when Toho was including Western actors and actresses to help with selling the films overseas. And there's one more that we'll see next week that also features an American member of the cast. But I mentioned that Adams was never really a big star, and while that is true and kind of unfortunate, his life itself was much more unfortunate of a tale. He died very young from an overdose of sleeping pills. It's not entirely verified, but he was going through a divorce, but it had not gone through at the time of his death. So his would-be ex-wife, Carol, was still listed as spouse on his death certificate. His friend Robert Conrad always claimed that his death was accidental and not a suicide. And one last thing about Adams is that it was very much later speculated that he was either gay or bisexual. He often went on studio-arranged dates with actresses that he co-starred with in his movies. He was often thought to be the lover of James Dean for a little bit. And that even called into question the nature of the relationship he had even with Elvis. There's a lot of question about this because of the era and that he died so young. So let's just say that it's well known that he was troubled, and that could mean he was troubled because of his sexuality and not being able to fully express it in the open. But enough about that. It's a lot of speculation, and I don't really want to get too far into that other than what has been said about him in the decade since his death. Let's talk about the monsters instead. Baragon is kind of a forgotten star of Toho films. Unlike another four-legged monster of note in Toho's lineup, Anguirus, Baragon didn't get as much opportunity or stature to appear alongside Godzilla. Perhaps Anguirus got the extra clout by appearing in the very first sequel and the very first time that there was a monster battle in the Godzilla films. But Baragon is a pretty cool flappy-eared monster with a big old horn on his face. He's kind of a cute fella. He later does appear in Destroy All Monsters, and then in the late 90s, he appeared on the Godzilla Island series, which is a series of 256 3-minute episodes that are now being added and showing on the official Godzilla YouTube channel. Then in the 2000s, he appeared in a fairly major role in the movie Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack. He was one of the three monsters who rose up to take on a sort of possessed Godzilla who was rampaging through Japan. And that was the only movie in the entire history of Godzilla that had King Ghidorah as a good guy when he faces off against Godzilla. Sadly, the title, like this episode, was getting a little too long, I think, to keep Baragon's name in the title. So he got a chance to appear in stock footage cameos in Final Wars in 2004, though, again, come on. Were there just too many monsters not to actually include Baragon in a scene? I mean, it seems like it's only fair that you would have brought him in for something, but since 2019, he's appeared on, guess what? Like the monsters I talked about previously this month, Baragon's appeared on the Godzilla series in Japan. But Baragon has gotten his due in video games, though, having appeared in 9 games total. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the monster that shares the title and the film with Baragon, and that would be Frankenstein's monster. This was about 4 or 5 years in the making. Toho wanted to do something with the Frankenstein monster. The first thought was as a sequel to a movie called The Human Vapor, in which a doctor uses science, he kind of, through which he kind of reverse engineers stuff from Frankenstein's notes in the sequel and in a way to revive a dead girlfriend. But that was canceled before a script was even given a completed first draft. There was an idea of having King Kong fight a Frankenstein monster, but that ultimately turned into King Kong versus Godzilla in 1962. Then Henry Saperstein came to Toho with the idea of having Frankenstein fight Godzilla in a film, which would be produced by Saperstein's United Productions of America. It just didn't really work out, so the movie became Mothra versus Godzilla. But finally, a plan was put into place to have Frankenstein fight a new Toho monster, Baragon. Much of the same concepts from the Godzilla script were retained, and that's how we get to this movie here. Before we dive into this movie, I have to mention that some time ago, I covered the very loose sequel to this movie, The War of the Gargantuas. That movie takes off of this movie by having cells from the giant Frankenstein monster mutate into 2 gargantuas. It's very quickly brushed over early on in the movie and not really as tightly connected to this film as you might expect when we think about a sequel. But in Frankenstein vs. Baragon, we start where else? Of course, in World War II Nazi Germany. Sure. But this is where the beating heart of the Frankenstein monster is confiscated by soldiers. It isn't just that the Nazis would simply take this monument of super science, but you'd kind of think they'd keep it for, Nazi stuff. But no, they load the heart up onto a submarine and ship it over to their buddies in Japan. I guess it is 1945 when all this happens, so I don't know, maybe it's that they see the writings on the wall and therefore decide that perhaps the Japanese have a better chance of lasting longer than they will, so maybe they should just take this heart as a gift. I don't know, but it does seem as though the Japanese understand that the Germans are cooked and wonder if maybe this very special thing that's being sent to them is a person, perhaps Hitler himself. But as the trade-off and the handoff happens from the German sub to the Japanese sub, the Japanese do barely escape with the heart as an American bomber flies overhead and destroys the German sub. Now, back in Japan, they soon discover that it is a heart, Frankenstein's heart. And a Japanese scientist tells the story of Dr. Frankenstein and his macabre experiments. And he says that if they can understand the science of this still beating heart and then use it to unlock further secrets of the cells of the human body, he says then 80 to 90% of all soldiers who die in war could be revived and saved. And as they begin to study it, they happen to be located in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. the lab is completely wiped out. 15 years later, Dr. James Bowen, played by Nick Adams, and his assistants studied possible cures for long-term patients at their facility with radiation poisoning and other ailments. Meanwhile, there's a small child who kind of haunts the streets of Hiroshima. He's feral and is catching, killing, and eating animals on the street. He leaves the remain of a rabbit in a schoolroom for kids to find. He's killed a neighborhood dog, and he looks something like a caveman. They actually continuously refer to him as a waif. But one night, Dr. Bowen and one of his assistants and love interest, Sueko Tagami, see the boy and has been injured by a passing car. She feeds the boy and he runs off. We flash forward another year and they cross paths with the boy once again and take him in off the streets to study him and find his parents. Later, the officer who delivered the heart to Hiroshima 16 years at this point, to where this movie is now taking place, is now a scientist of his own right and working at an oil refinery. And he learns of a boy that was found in Hiroshima who shows incredible resistance to radiation. However, when he's reminded of the heart that can never die, his memories of the incident are interrupted by a strange earthquake that may just be caused by the strange kaiju Baragon. Back at the doctor's place with the kid that they brought in, he's growing in size extremely quickly. Bowen studies him and spots that he has strange blue eyes and that his growth is likely due to the intake of proteins. He also is starting to act a little more violent. First, by being scared of a man on the TV that he's watching, screaming. And then second, by scaring the scientist when he seems to be lunging at Sueko. The second thing was not to harm her, but because he was fascinated by a bauble that she wears as a necklace. The growth of the boy and the strength that he's gaining quickly is causing some issues with how to keep him and others safe. Soon, the naval officer, Mr. Kawai, comes to visit Bowen and Sueko, and he tells them of the Frankenstein heart. Later, Bowen and his other assistant go and track down the scientist from the beginning of the movie, and he explains how the monster would always die and come back to life. It also could regenerate limbs that were cut off, and the creature never seemed to feel much pain like a normal living thing. And it's at this point they kind of put two and two together that this feral child has grown from the Frankenstein heart and its regenerative properties. The Frankenstein monster escapes one night after being frightened, and he makes his way to Sueko's apartment to see her, but he's scared off again by the sirens of police cars and flees into the night. The next day, when investigating the cell the monster was kept in, they discover that Frankenstein was able to escape his chains because the cuff severed his hand, and that hand is still crawling around in the cell. And that leads to Bowen and his scientists studying how the hand interacts and regenerates and how it's managed to stay alive without a brain or a heart. Now, in time, Frankenstein is making his way across Japan before eventually appearing in the water where he menaces a party boat before once again disappearing. Eventually, Frankenstein makes his way to the countryside where he tries to hide himself in the mountains and forests and valleys, but constantly he's hounded by the Japan Self-Defense Forces. He's growing faster and faster, which requires him to consume more and more protein. However, also in the country is Baragon, so he keeps burrowing underground, which causes earthquakes and sinkholes that destroy villages. And while initially this is all blamed on Frankenstein, but that Mr. Kawai character reveals that the destructions actually that's being blamed on Frankenstein might just actually be the actions of Baragon, who he personally witnessed at the oil refinery. But there's one little problem. No one but our primary cast of scientists trying to keep Frankenstein safe believes Kawai's story of seeing a prehistoric-looking four-legged creature. But then again, I mean, this is the world of Godzilla and all the other monsters in Toho's lineup, right? But I find it kind of hard to believe that paleontologists don't believe that a Baragon could exist. And then if this isn't in the Godzilla world, then I find that hard to believe because Baragon shows up in Godzilla movies later. But you know what? Just never mind. When Bowen and his assistants try to find Frankenstein to calm him down, they accidentally lure Baragon out. And while running away, Sueko falls and is nearly trampled by Baragon, but Frankenstein comes to save the day and fight the monster. And Baragon has a couple of attacks. One is to kind of spring off of his back feet and lunge at Frankenstein. And the other is a fiery breath that he charges up by seeing the horn on his face glow. Frankenstein is kind of unaffected by the fire breath. I mean, he takes a couple of hits from that, but doesn't seem to be too badly hurt by it. He doesn't want to be hit by it, but he doesn't seem to be too hurt by it. And sometimes he takes a couple of the lunges. But Baragon is able to escape by burrowing, but Frankenstein catches up with him when Baragon is about to attack another village. The fight between the two giants is somewhat vicious and looks a little bit more like a no-holds-barred wrestling match. Frankenstein does not mess around. He hurls whole trees that he's ripped up out of the ground at Baragon. He constantly tries using King Kong's favorite tactic by ripping Baragon's jaws clean open. And eventually, though, Frankenstein is able to put Baragon down by way of breaking the creature's neck. Then, out of nowhere, a giant octopus emerges from the ground, saying that he's got next in a fight against a newly crowned heavyweight champion. And so Frankenstein obliges him, and they fight. The octopus pulls Frankenstein off of a cliff and into the water, and the last we see of Frankenstein is him being pulled under by one of the octopus's tentacles. Bowen and his assistants ponder the fate of Frankenstein, and if it truly is best for him to return or for him to have perished, considering the world will never really see him as anything but a monster. So let's talk about the three things I like about Ishiro Honda's Frankenstein vs. Baragon. First, I like how this movie begins quite a bit. At the very beginning, you have this strange opening in Germany with the Nazi soldiers taking the Frankenstein heart. And what's weird about it is how the motions and the activities of the scientists are kind of overly physically acted. It's all very silent movie era in style and verbose gestures and emotions. The soldiers come in and say nothing but do the Nazi salute thing and then show the papers demanding the heart be turned over to them. And there is not a line of dialogue spoken in that opening scene. Everything is almost played out in gestures like a mime would. But then it moves to the handoff of the heart, and there's dialogue about how this is very clearly the end of the line for Germany, and whatever it is they want to give them is maybe one of the most vital, important things ever, because the Germans will take it so far on boat and sacrifice that sub over it. Then, where do they take it? To Hiroshima on August 6th. That all wonderfully plays out to bury the heart and give us a little bit of an unexpected twist in the story to really kind of get the plot moving. Second, I like how Toho plays with the concept of Frankenstein's monster in this movie. The heart, once it's revived, can't ever die. If you seemingly put that heart into a dead body, it will revive it and keep that body alive. If that body dies, it will either come back to life or you can move the heart to a new body. If you cut off limbs, the body will grow them back. While none of those things are technically what we know of the Frankenstein legend in the movies, especially in the Universal era, it is true that if the monster dies, you can just shock him back into a revival. But I like that Toho took this much further than Universal or Hammer ever did and just said that the heart itself could grow a new monster around it. That's really different and a pretty interesting take. And what's more, the monster ended up with some basic survival instincts too. It didn't have a mother or nurturing presence in his life to teach him how to survive, but he just knew how to, so he took to the streets and ate whatever he could catch. Then all of this is an interesting new twist on the monster, but it also makes him a lot more sympathetic when he escapes after being scared and bothered by bright lights from the television crew that scared him out of his cell at the lab, and also the noise on the television. And it also helps that that this Frankenstein monster is played as something of a child, and there's a great deal of personal connection with Sueko, who happens to be one of our leads. And third, when Baragon is revealed and we see him cutting his path through villages and farms, we see some fairly gnarly stuff, and it's all done in the most charming way possible. So we all know that most of the Toho monsters are simply guys in rubber suits, right? Well, that's certainly true for Baragon. He's a guy crawling on all fours in a rubber suit. So when he's rampaging through these villages and whatnot, he's obviously smashing up miniatures. And when he's shown to attack and devour pigs and chickens, it shows him walking away after showing us these chickens that are frightened. And when he's got feathers coming out of his mouth as he munches, that was fairly chuckle-worthy, but in all the right ways. But it's nothing compared to when he comes across a stable with a horse in it. Not only is this horse a puppet or sometimes a figurine, but when Baragon smashes through the stable, we see the horse trampled and it whinnies in pain and fear. It's kind of gruesome, really. But yeah, horse meat was apparently on the menu that day for Baragon. And it was a pretty great scene and pretty charming in all the right ways, like I said. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. And don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. We conclude this month of looking at Toho monster movies not starring Godzilla with the next best thing to Big G in a monster movie with King Kong Escapes. Until next week, stay spooky.